"I give you my native daughter as wife, because the man alone defended our lands," declared the tribal chief. The Winchester rifle's barrel gleamed against the setting sun as Ethan Cross pressed his back against the weathered boulder, counting the shadows moving between the canyon walls. 23 riders. Maybe more hiding in the brush. His calloused fingers traced the carved initials on his rifle's stocky C. A reminder of the man he used to be before the frontier swallowed everything he held dear. 3 days of relentless pursuit had led him here, to this narrow passage between towering red sandstone cliffs where the Apache called Eagle Ridge home. The irony wasn't lost on him. A white man seeking refuge among the very people most settlers feared, while his own kind hunted him like a rabid dog. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off canyon walls, growing closer with each thundering heartbeat. Dust clouds rose beyond the ridgeline, signaling the approaching danger that had been stalking him since Fort Bridger. Colonel Morrison's men wouldn't stop until they dragged him back in chains or brought back his corpse wrapped in canvas. But they didn't know about the narrow deer trail that wound up the eastern face of Eagle Ridge. They didn't know about the hidden Apache settlement that existed in the shadow of these ancient stones. Most importantly, they didn't know that Ethan Cross had once saved the life of Chief Running Bear's daughter, earning him safe passage through these sacred lands. The memory flooded back as he began his careful ascent up the rocky trail. 2 years earlier, while tracking stolen cattle near the Rio Grande, he'd found her trapped beneath a fallen horse, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Any other man might have ridden past, but something in her peaceful face reminded him of his younger sister, the one lost to cholera during the journey west. He'd spent 3 days nursing her back to health in a makeshift shelter, sharing his water and hardtack, speaking to her in the broken Apache he'd learned from trading posts. When Running Bear's warriors finally found them, they expected to find their chief's daughter dead or worse. Instead, they discovered a white man who had risked his own safety to care for someone most of his people considered an enemy. The trail narrowed as it climbed higher, forcing Ethan to lead his mare by the reins while navigating loose shale and jutting rocks. Behind him, the sound of the pursuing cavalry grew fainter, though he knew they would eventually find his tracks. Colonel Morrison was many things: corrupt, violent, drunk on his own authority, but he wasn't stupid. He would station men at every water source and trading post between here and the Mexican border. The accusation that brought him to this desperate flight played over and over in his mind like a broken music box. Someone had murdered 3 settlers near Deadwood Creek, and Morrison needed a scapegoat. A drifter with no family, no permanent address, and a reputation for keeping to himself made the perfect target. The fact that Ethan had been 50 miles away, helping a widow repair her barn, meant nothing when the colonel had already decided his guilt. Mrs. Patterson had sworn to his whereabouts, her weathered hands shaking as she faced down Morrison's intimidating presence. But her testimony was dismissed with a wave of his gloved hand. A woman's word held little weight against military authority, especially when that authority was backed by 6 armed soldiers. As the trail crested a natural shelf in the cliff face, the hidden valley of Eagle Ridge opened before him. Adobe structures built into cave openings dotted the canyon walls like ancient apartment buildings. Smoke rose from carefully concealed fires, and the sound of children playing drifted across the valley floor. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash flourished in the protected basin, fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep underground. It was a place untouched by the railroad fever and gold madness that had consumed the territories. Here, life moved at the rhythm of seasons rather than stock prices. Here, a man's worth was measured by his actions rather than the weight of his coin purse. But even this sanctuary couldn't guarantee safety. The army had been pushing Apache tribes onto reservations with increasing aggression, and Running Bear's band represented one of the last holdouts. Their continued freedom existed at the sufferance of officials who could revoke their provisional treaty at any moment. Ethan's arrival would complicate that delicate balance. Harboring a fugitive from military justice could provide Morrison with the excuse he needed to attack the settlement. The thought made his stomach clench with guilt. These people had shown him kindness when his own kind sought his destruction, and now his presence might bring that same destruction upon them. The sentry spotted him first, a young warrior named Swift Arrow, whose keen eyes missed nothing that moved in his domain. Recognition flickered across his painted features, followed quickly by concern. News traveled fast in these close-knit communities, and Ethan's desperate circumstances were written clearly in his dust-covered appearance, and the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. Swift Arrow gestured toward the largest dwelling, carved into a natural cave system near the valley's center. Chief Running Bear would want to hear this story directly, would want to understand what forces pursued the white man who had once protected his most precious daughter. The walk across the valley floor felt like a march to judgment. Women paused in their corn grinding to watch him pass. Children ceased their games to stare with the frank curiosity of the young. Warriors emerged from shadowed doorways, their hands never far from knife hilts and bowstrings. This was the moment of truth. These people owed him nothing beyond the single debt already paid. They had every reason to turn him away, to protect their own interests over his desperate need for sanctuary. Yet something in their careful observation suggested they were weighing more than simple arithmetic of debt and obligation. The chief's dwelling was larger than the others, its entrance decorated with symbols that spoke of status and spiritual authority. Strings of beads and carved fetishes hung from the doorframe, catching the last rays of sunlight that penetrated the valley's protective walls. The scent of sage and sweetgrass drifted from within, mixed with the earthy aroma of clay and leather. Running Bear emerged before Ethan could announce his presence, as if the older man had sensed his approach through some mystical connection to the land. Age had carved deep lines in the chief's weathered face, but his eyes remained sharp and penetrating. He wore traditional clothing, buckskin pants and shirt, decorated with intricate beadwork, but Ethan noticed the modern rifle leaning against the cave wall just inside the entrance. The two men regarded each other in silence, a moment stretched taut with unspoken communication. Running Bear's eyes took in every detail, the urgency in Ethan's posture, the dust that spoke of hard riding, the careful way his hand remained near his weapon despite being in supposedly friendly territory. "You returned to us under storm clouds," the chief said finally, his English accented but clear. "What trouble follows the white man who once showed kindness to my daughter?" The directness of the question demanded an equally honest answer. Ethan removed his hat, a gesture of respect that wasn't lost on the assembled crowd that had gathered at a discreet distance. Children peered around their mothers' skirts while warriors maintained expressions of studied neutrality. "False accusations from false men," Ethan replied. "A colonel who needs someone to blame for murders I didn't commit. They're maybe 2 hours behind me, tracking through the lower canyons." Running Bear nodded slowly, as if this news confirmed something he had already suspected. Colonel Morrison. The name hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Everyone knew Morrison's reputation. His methods for dealing with Apache resistance had earned him praise from territorial politicians and condemnation from anyone with a functioning moral compass. He was exactly the kind of man who would manufacture evidence to support his predetermined conclusions. "My presence brings danger to your people," Ethan continued. "I can't ask you to risk everything for my sake." A slight smile creased the chief's weathered features. "You do not ask, but neither do you turn away from what is right when the cost is high. This I remember about the man who tended my daughter when she lay broken beside the great river." The chief raised his voice, addressing not just Ethan but the entire gathering that had formed around them. Warriors, women, children, elders, representatives of every aspect of Apache life in this hidden valley. Their faces reflected the gravity of the decision being contemplated. Long ago, our grandfathers spoke of times when the world would change faster than the seasons. when old ways would struggle against new powers, and good men would be forced to stand against evil regardless of the color of their skin. They told us that wisdom lies not in blind loyalty to blood, but in recognition of character. He paused, allowing his words to settle into the consciousness of his listeners. Several warriors nodded slowly, understanding dawning in their expressions. The women drew their children closer, protective instincts warring with curiosity about what their chief might decide. This white man proved his character when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose by helping one of us. He did not know who she was, did not know what reward or punishment might follow his choice. He acted from the heart, as a man should act when faced with suffering. Running Bear's daughter emerged from the crowd as if summoned by her father's words. Ayanna had grown from the injured girl Ethan remembered into a striking young woman of 20 summers. Her dark hair was braided with silver ornaments that caught the fading light, and her buckskin dress was decorated with beadwork that spoke of high status within the tribe. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, intelligent, compassionate, and utterly fearless. She looked directly at Ethan as she approached, and he found himself remembering the conversations they'd shared during those 3 days beside the Rio Grande. Despite the language barrier, they had communicated about everything from the behavior of desert animals to the stories told by star patterns. Her curiosity about the world beyond Apache territory had been matched only by his fascination with her people's deep connection to the land. "You saved my life once," Ayanna said, her English more polished than her father's. "Now circumstances allow us to return that favor." The chief gestured toward the western rim of the valley, where shadows were growing longer as the sun continued its descent. "Morrison's soldiers will not enter these lands while daylight remains. They fear what darkness might hide in places they do not understand. But when morning comes, they will probe every canyon and water source until they find what they seek." Ethan felt the weight of decision pressing down upon him. Acceptance of their offer would mean placing these people in direct conflict with military authority. Refusal would mean facing Morrison's justice alone, a prospect that held little hope for survival, let alone vindication. "There is another way," Running Bear continued, "but it requires trust on all sides and courage to walk a path that has never been walked before." The chief's words carried the weight of ceremony, as if he were about to propose something that would alter the fundamental relationship between their peoples. Warriors shifted restlessly, sensing the magnitude of whatever decision was approaching. "Speak plainly, father," Ayanna said softly. "The sun sets quickly, and choices made in darkness often look different in morning light." Running Bear straightened to his full height, every inch the leader who had guided his people through decades of conflict and change. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions for an entire community. 3 days from now, the moon will be full. It is the time when we celebrate the harvest, when young people choose their paths toward adulthood, when the spirits of our ancestors walk closest to the world of the living. He paused, studying Ethan's face intently. "It is also the time when a man may join our tribe through marriage, taking on all the responsibilities and protections that such a bond provides." The implications hit Ethan like a physical blow. Marriage into the tribe would grant him legal protection under Apache law, recognition that might complicate Morrison's ability to simply drag him away in chains. But it would also mean abandoning his former life entirely, becoming something that existed between two worlds without fully belonging to either. Ayanna's expression remained carefully neutral, but Ethan caught a flicker of something curiosity, perhaps, or calculation of her own. This proposition affected her as much as him, binding her fate to that of a fugitive whose very presence threatened everything her people had built. The gathered crowd buzzed with whispered conversations in Apache as the full meaning of their chief's words became clear. Some voices carried notes of excitement, others concern. A few of the younger warriors looked distinctly unhappy at the prospect of their chief's daughter being promised to an outsider, regardless of his previous service to their people. Father, Ayana said carefully, such a decision should not be made in haste. This man faces immediate danger, but marriage is a bond that lasts until the earth reclaims what it has given. Her words carried wisdom beyond her years, but also something else, a challenge, perhaps, to determine whether this desperate proposal was born of genuine feeling or merely expedience. Ethan found himself studying her face, trying to read the thoughts behind those intelligent eyes. The truth was that he had thought of her often during the 2 years since their first meeting. Her image had appeared in his dreams. Her voice had echoed in quiet moments around evening campfires. But admitting such feelings now, under these circumstances, seemed to cheapen whatever connection might exist between them. Time is a luxury we do not possess, Running Bear replied, but wisdom is a necessity we cannot abandon. The choice must be freely made by both parties with full understanding of what it means. He turned his attention back to Ethan, fixing him with that penetrating stare that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. You would gain protection, but also responsibility. You would become not just a member of our tribe, but a guardian of our people's future. Can you accept such weight? The question demanded more than a simple yes or no. It required Ethan to examine the fundamental nature of who he was and who he might become. His life as a drifter, answerable to no one but himself, had been simple if lonely. Membership in Apache society would mean obligations that extended far beyond his own survival. But as he looked around at the faces surrounding him, men, women, and children who had managed to preserve their way of life despite overwhelming pressure from the outside world, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, a recognition that some things were worth fighting for beyond mere personal interest. I can accept the weight, he said quietly. The question is whether I'm worthy of carrying it. Running Bear's stern expression softened slightly, the first hint of approval flickering in his weathered features. Worthiness is not claimed but proven. You have made a good beginning. The chief raised his hand, calling for attention from the assembled crowd. When silence fell over the valley, he spoke in Apache, his words flowing with the rhythm of formal ceremony. Even without understanding the language, Ethan could hear the gravity in each carefully chosen phrase. When the chief finished speaking, a murmur ran through the crowd, not disapproval, but the sound of people processing unexpected news. Several of the older women nodded approvingly, while a few of the warriors maintained expressions of stoic neutrality. I have told them of your deed by the great river, Running Bear explained. I have told them of the danger that pursues you and of the choice that lies before us all. They will consider what has been said and give their counsel when the moon reaches its highest point. Ayana stepped forward, moving with the unconscious grace that came from a lifetime spent navigating rough terrain. Until then, you should rest and eat. The decisions ahead require clear thinking and strong spirit. She gestured toward a smaller dwelling carved into the canyon wall about 50 yards from her father's home. Smoke rose from its chimney opening, suggesting that preparations had already been made for a guest. My Aunt Swift Cloud has prepared a place for you. She will tend to your needs while the council deliberates. The practical arrangements felt surreal after the magnitude of what had just been proposed. In the space of an hour, Ethan had gone from hunted fugitive to potential tribal member and husband. The speed of these changes left him feeling slightly disconnected from reality, as if he were watching events unfold from somewhere outside his own body. Swift Cloud emerged from the designated dwelling as they approached. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, her face marked by sun and wind but not yet carved by age. Her English was limited, but her gestures were clear as she indicated the interior of the small home. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, carved deep into the living rock and expanded through generations of careful work. A central fire pit provided warmth and light, while sleeping alcoves had been carved into the walls and lined with soft furs. Clay pots and woven baskets lined shelves chiseled from the stone, and the air carried the comforting sense of sage, cedar, and well-prepared food. A meal had been laid out on woven mats near the fire: roasted rabbit, corn cakes, wild onions, and a kind of tea made from desert plants Ethan couldn't identify. The simple fare represented a feast by trail standards, and his empty stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since dawn. Swiftcloud gestured for him to sit and eat, her maternal instincts overriding any political complications his presence might represent. Food was food, hospitality was hospitality, and a hungry man required tending regardless of what councils might decide about his future. As Ethan ate, the reality of his situation began to settle into his consciousness. Tomorrow would bring either acceptance into a new life or exposure to Morrison's justice. There would be no middle ground, no compromise that allowed him to maintain his former existence while gaining Apache protection. The choice wasn't really his to make. Running Bear and his people would decide based on their own needs and their assessment of what his presence might mean for their community's future. Ayanna would have her own voice in that decision, her own reasons for accepting or rejecting a marriage that had been proposed rather than chosen. But sitting in this warm dwelling, listening to the quiet sounds of a community going about its evening routines, Ethan realized that his heart had already made its choice. He had been running for so long from false accusations, from loneliness, from the emptiness of a life without purpose, that the possibility of belonging somewhere seemed like a miracle. Whether that miracle would prove real or illusory remained to be seen. Outside, the sounds of the Apache settlement continued their evening rhythm. Children's laughter echoed off canyon walls as they played games in the fading light. Women called out to each other as they finished daily tasks, their voices carrying the comfortable familiarity of people who had shared countless such evenings. The soft percussion of drums began somewhere in the distance, marking the beginning of what Ethan assumed was some kind of evening ceremony. Swiftcloud returned with additional blankets and a change of clothing, buckskin pants and shirt that looked to be approximately his size. She pantomimed washing and pointed toward a curtained alcove where steaming water waited in a large clay basin. The luxury of a hot bath felt almost decadent after days of trail dust and cold camp washing. As he cleaned away the grime of his desperate flight, Ethan found his mind wandering to the extraordinary turn his life had taken. This morning he had been a hunted man with dwindling options and little hope. Now he faced the possibility of a completely new existence, one that would require him to abandon everything familiar about his identity. The buckskin clothing fit surprisingly well, and the material felt comfortable against his skin. Looking at his reflection in the polished metal mirror Swiftcloud provided, he barely recognized himself. The transformation was more than merely external. Something about wearing Apache clothing made him feel different, as if he were trying on a new version of who he might become. When he emerged from the washing alcove, he found Ayanna waiting by the fire. She had exchanged her earlier dress for something more elaborate, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the firelight in complex patterns. Her presence filled the small space with an energy that made his pulse quicken. "The council will meet when the moon reaches its highest point," she said without preamble. "Until then, we should speak honestly about what tomorrow might bring." She settled onto one of the woven mats near the fire, gesturing for him to join her. The gesture was casual, but Ethan sensed the weight of ceremony in this moment. Whatever they discussed here would shape the foundation of any relationship that might follow. "Your father's proposal honors me," he began carefully, "but I won't pretend circumstances aren't driving this decision. You deserve better than a marriage born of desperation." Ayanna studied his face in the flickering firelight. "Do you think so little of Apache women that you believe we cannot recognize the difference between necessity and opportunity?" The question caught him off guard. He had been prepared for discussion about practical arrangements, not a challenge to his assumptions about her agency in this situation. "I think Apache women are probably wiser than most," he replied honestly, "which makes me wonder what wisdom sees in accepting a fugitive husband." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Perhaps wisdom sees a man who once risked everything to help a stranger." Perhaps it sees someone who chose to warn us about the danger his presence might bring, rather than simply taking what shelter he could find. She paused, her expression growing more serious. Or perhaps wisdom sees that our people face challenges that require new kinds of thinking. The old ways of dealing with white authority are no longer sufficient. We need allies who understand both worlds. Her words carried implications that extended far beyond personal relationships. She was speaking about political strategy, about survival in a changing landscape where traditional approaches might no longer prove adequate. "You're talking about more than marriage," Ethan observed. "You're talking about building bridges between peoples who've been enemies." "I am talking about survival," Ayanna replied. "Not just for individuals, but for entire ways of life. My people have strength, but we lack understanding of how white society truly functions. You have that understanding, along with something rarer, the character to use it honorably." The conversation was moving into territory that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She was proposing not just personal union, but a kind of partnership that could influence the future of her entire tribe. "And what if Morrison comes anyway?" Ethan asked. "What if marriage doesn't provide the protection your father believes it will?" Ayanna's eyes hardened, revealing the warrior spirit that lived beneath her diplomatic exterior. "Then we fight. But we fight with better knowledge of our enemy's methods and weaknesses." The drums outside grew louder, joined by voices raised in what sounded like storytelling or ceremonial recitation. The sound seemed to wrap around their conversation, providing a backdrop of cultural continuity that emphasized the magnitude of what they were discussing. "There's something else," Ayanna continued. "Something my father did not mention in his public proposal." She stood and moved to a wooden chest carved with traditional symbols. From within, she withdrew a rolled piece of paper that looked distinctly official. When she unrolled it, Ethan could see it was some kind of legal document, complete with governmental seals and formal signatures. "A treaty," she explained, "signed 3 years ago by territorial representatives and my father. It grants our band specific rights to these lands in exchange for maintaining peace with white settlements in the region." Ethan examined the document more closely. The legal language was complex, but the basic terms seemed straightforward enough. The Apache band would be allowed to remain in their traditional territory as long as they refrained from raiding activities and provided assistance to lost travelers. "Morrison knows about this treaty?" he asked. "He was one of the witnesses to its signing," Ayanna confirmed. "But he has been looking for excuses to void its terms ever since. Our presence here interferes with his plans for a military outpost that would control trade routes through this region." The political landscape was suddenly much clearer. Morrison's pursuit wasn't just about bringing in a fugitive. It was about manufacturing an excuse to remove the Apache presence that stood in the way of his ambitions. "If he can claim that we are harboring criminals," Ayanna continued, "he can argue that we have violated the peace terms of our treaty. That would give him legal justification for forced relocation." "But marriage would make me a member of the tribe," Ethan said, understanding dawning. "Subject to Apache law rather than territorial justice." "Exactly. And the treaty explicitly recognizes our right to govern internal tribal matters, including marriage and adoption customs. Morrison would have to prove that you committed crimes after becoming one of us, not before." The legal strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Marriage would create a jurisdictional shield that Morrison would find difficult to penetrate through normal channels. But it would also escalate the conflict, forcing the colonel to either retreat or find more dramatic ways to achieve his objectives. "You've thought this through carefully," Ethan observed. "I have had 2 years to think about it," Ayanna replied. "Ever since the day you returned me to my people, I knew that our paths would cross again. The spirits whispered of it in dreams, showed me visions of choices that would shape many lives." Her words carried the weight of Apache spiritual tradition, the belief that significant events were foretold through dreams and signs. Ethan had lived long enough in the territories to respect such beliefs, even if he didn't fully share them. And what did these visions show you about the outcomes of those choices? Ayana returned the treaty to its chest before answering. Visions show possibilities, not certainties. They revealed a white man standing beside Apache warriors facing dangers that threatened both peoples. They showed a woman choosing a path that honored both love and duty. But the ending remains unwritten. The drums outside reached a crescendo before suddenly falling silent. In the quiet that followed, Ethan could hear individual voices discussing the evening's events, the tone suggesting that word of the council meeting had spread throughout the settlement. "Are you afraid?" Ayana asked softly. The question was simple, but it cut through all the political complexity to the heart of what they were really discussing. Fear was a luxury that people in their situation couldn't afford to indulge, but it was also a reality that couldn't be ignored. "Yes," Ethan admitted. "Not of Morrison or his soldiers. I've faced worse odds and walked away. But this, committing to a life I've never lived, to responsibilities I don't fully understand, that scares me more than any gunfight." "Good," Ayana said with surprising firmness. "A man who feels no fear at such a moment lacks either wisdom or imagination. Both are necessary for what lies ahead." She moved closer, near enough that he could smell the sage smoke in her hair and see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "But fear must be balanced with trust. Do you trust me to help guide you through the challenges of Apache life?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "And do you trust yourself to learn what you must learn, to become what circumstances require you to become?" That question required more consideration. Ethan had spent years defining himself as a loner, someone who depended on no one and had no obligations beyond his own survival. The transformation Ayana was describing would require abandoning that identity entirely. "I trust myself to try," he said finally. "Whether that's enough remains to be seen." Ayana nodded, seeming satisfied with his honesty. "Trying is all any of us can do. The rest depends on circumstances beyond our control." A soft cough outside the entrance announced another visitor. Swift Cloud's voice called out in Apache, and Ayana responded in the same language. After a brief exchange, the older woman entered carrying a bundle of what appeared to be ceremonial items. "My aunt brings preparation materials for tomorrow's ceremony," Ayana explained. "If the council agrees to my father's proposal, we must be ready to proceed immediately." Swift Cloud spread several items on the mat between them: feathers, carved stones, small pouches of what smelled like various herbs and incense materials. She spoke rapidly to Ayana, gesturing frequently toward Ethan as she outlined what appeared to be complex instructions. "She explains the ceremony requirements," Ayana translated. "Apache marriage customs differ significantly from white traditions. The focus is on joining not just two individuals, but two family lines, two sets of spiritual obligations." "What does that mean practically?" "It means you will swear oaths not just to me, but to my father, to my ancestors, to the spirits that protect our people. In exchange, you will receive their protection and guidance. But the obligations are real and permanent." Swift Cloud produced a piece of cloth and began mixing various powders from her pouches, creating what looked like war paint. She gestured for Ethan to turn his face toward the firelight, then began applying the mixture in careful patterns across his forehead and cheeks. "Traditional markings," Ayana explained. "They tell the story of who you are becoming, what responsibilities you are accepting." The paint felt cool against his skin, and the herbs in the mixture made his face tingle slightly. Swift Cloud worked with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual many times, each brushstroke deliberate and meaningful. When she finished, she held up the polished metal mirror for Ethan to see the results. The markings transformed his appearance even more dramatically than the buckskin clothing had. Looking at his reflection, he saw not a white drifter but someone who existed between worlds, marked by both cultures but belonging fully to neither. Swift Cloud gathered her materials and spoke quietly to Ayana before departing. Her tone carried maternal warmth mixed with serious concern, the voice of someone who cared deeply about the outcome of tomorrow's decisions. "She will return before dawn to complete the preparations," Ayanna said. "If the council approves, the ceremony will take place when the sun reaches its highest point. And if they disapprove?" Ayanna's expression grew solemn. "Then you will leave at first light before Morrison's men begin their search of the upper canyons. My father will provide you with fresh supplies and directions to water sources that might keep you ahead of pursuit." The alternative seemed stark by comparison, another flight into uncertain territory, another desperate attempt to stay ahead of forces determined to destroy him. But Ethan realized that even failure here would leave him better off than he had been that morning. These people had offered him hope when he had none, possibilities when all seemed lost. "Whatever the council decides," he said, "I'm grateful for what you and your people have already given me." "Gratitude is good," Ayanna replied, "but it should not be confused with resignation. Tomorrow's outcome depends partially on how well you present yourself to the council, how convincingly you demonstrate your commitment to our people's welfare." She stood and moved to the entrance of the dwelling, looking out at the settlement where lights flickered in windows and doorways. The Apache community was preparing for sleep, but Ethan could sense an underlying tension in the air, an awareness that tomorrow would bring decisions that affected everyone. "The council members are wise," Ayanna continued, "but they are also practical. They will want to know not just what you have done in the past, but what you can contribute to our future. Your knowledge of white society, your skills as a fighter and tracker, your understanding of territorial politics, all of these things matter as much as personal character." "What should I emphasize?" "Truth," she said simply. "Apache people have little patience for fancy words or false promises. Speak plainly about your abilities and your limitations. Let them see who you really are, not who you think they want you to be." A distant howl echoed across the canyon, answered by others from different directions. Coyotes beginning their nightly chorus, a sound that had become as familiar to Ethan as his own heartbeat during years of trail life. But hearing it here, in this protected valley, it seemed different, somehow less lonely, more connected to the larger rhythm of desert existence. "I should let you rest," Ayanna said, though she made no move to leave. "Tomorrow will require all your strength and clarity. Will you be there? At the council meeting?" "I will speak for myself," she confirmed. "Apache women have voices in matters that concern their own lives. My opinion will carry weight in the final decision. And what will that opinion be?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the star-filled sky visible through the dwelling's smoke hole. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "I will tell them that some risks are worth taking when the potential rewards are great enough. I will tell them that our people need allies who understand both worlds, and such understanding cannot be found among those who have never lived outside their own culture." She turned back to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. "I will also tell them that a woman should not be given in marriage like a prize or a payment of debt. If I agree to become your wife, it will be because I choose you as much as circumstances choose us." "And have you made that choice?" "I am making it," she replied. "With each conversation, each moment of observation, each measure of your character. By tomorrow's council meeting, I will know." The honesty of her response was both refreshing and intimidating. She was evaluating him as carefully as he was trying to understand what life among her people would entail. The marriage, if it happened, would be a true partnership rather than a desperate arrangement of convenience. After she left, Ethan lay on the soft furs that served as his bed, staring up at the star-filled sky through the smoke hole. Sleep seemed impossible with so many thoughts churning through his mind, but exhaustion from his desperate flight gradually overcame mental agitation. His dreams were filled with images of pursuit and sanctuary, of faces painted for war and ceremony, of choices that seemed to carry the weight of destiny. When he woke before dawn, he found Swift Cloud already present, quietly preparing materials for what might be his wedding day. Swift Cloud worked in reverent silence as dawn painted the canyon walls amber and gold. Her weathered hands moved with practiced precision, preparing ceremonial items whose significance Ethan could only guess at. Feathers were arranged in specific patterns, stones placed according to ancient meaning, and various powders mixed in clay bowls that released aromatic smoke when touched by flame. The older woman had arrived before he fully awakened, moving through the dwelling like a protective spirit, ensuring all details were properly attended to. Her presence brought maternal comfort that reminded Ethan of his own mother, dead these 10 years from consumption no frontier doctor could cure. Outside, the settlement stirred to life with familiar sounds. Children's voices carried across the valley as families began daily routines. The scent of cooking fires mixed with crisp mountain air, creating domestic tranquility that seemed impossible given the circumstances that had brought him here. But tranquility was illusion that could shatter at any moment. Colonel Morrison's men were somewhere in the canyons below, methodically searching for his trail. Time was running short, and today would determine whether he found permanent sanctuary or faced capture by forces that had already decided his guilt. Swift Cloud gestured for him to sit near the fire while she completed preparations. She had brought fresh clothing more elaborate than what he had worn the previous evening, with intricate beadwork that spoke of ceremonial importance. The buckskin was softer than anything he had ever worn, decorated with symbols that seemed to tell a story he couldn't read, but somehow understood. As she helped him into the ceremonial garments, Swift Cloud spoke quietly in Apache. Her tone was serious but not unkind, and even without understanding her words, Ethan could sense that she was offering some form of blessing or guidance. When she finished speaking, she placed both hands on his shoulders and looked directly into his eyes, nodding once in what seemed like approval. The transformation was remarkable. Looking at his reflection in the polished metal mirror, Ethan saw someone who existed at the intersection of two worlds. The Apache clothing and ceremonial markings had not erased his white heritage, but they had created something new, a visual representation of the cultural bridge he was being asked to become. A soft sound at the entrance announced another visitor. Running Bear entered, followed by 3 other men whom Ethan recognized as senior members of the tribe. Their expressions were grave but not hostile, carrying the weight of men who had spent the night in serious deliberation. The chief wore full ceremonial regalia, an elaborate headdress decorated with eagle feathers, a shirt covered in intricate beadwork, and a necklace of carved bones and stones that spoke of spiritual authority. His companions were similarly dressed, transforming the small dwelling into a formal council chamber. Running Bear studied Ethan's appearance with obvious approval before speaking. "The council has considered your request for sanctuary and my daughter's willingness to accept you as husband. We have weighed the benefits against the risks, examined your character as we understand it, and consulted the spirits for guidance." The formal tone made it clear that this was an official pronouncement, not casual conversation between friends. Ethan straightened his shoulders and met the chief's gaze directly, prepared to accept whatever decision had been reached. "Our conclusion is that circumstances have brought us to a moment that requires wisdom beyond normal considerations. The old ways of dealing with white authority are no longer sufficient for the challenges we face. We need new approaches, new alliances, new forms of strength." One of the council members stepped forward, an elderly man whose face bore the scars of old battles. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "You fought for us when you had no obligation to do so. You protected what was precious to us when you could have gained nothing from such protection. These actions speak of character that transcends the color of skin. Therefore," Running Bear continued, "the council accepts your request for sanctuary through marriage to my daughter, with the understanding that such acceptance carries obligations that extend far beyond personal survival." Relief flooded through Ethan's chest, followed immediately by sobering awareness of what lay ahead. Acceptance was only the beginning. The real challenges would come in proving himself worthy of the trust these people were placing in him. However, the chief added, his tone becoming more serious, circumstances require that the ceremony take place immediately. Our scouts report that soldiers are moving through the lower canyons, conducting a systematic search that will reach this valley by midday. Are you prepared to take the oaths required of Apache husbands? Running Bear asked. To swear loyalty not just to my daughter, but to our people, our ways, our survival? I am, Ethan replied without hesitation. The council members filed out, leaving Ethan alone with Swiftcloud once again. The older woman resumed her work with renewed urgency, applying additional ceremonial markings to his arms and chest while explaining procedures through gestures and a few English words she knew. Swiftcloud produced a leather pouch containing ceremonial items, carved stones, pieces of metal that might have been old jewelry, and several objects he couldn't identify. She gestured for him to choose 3 items, though the basis for that choice remained unclear. Following instinct more than understanding, Ethan selected a smooth river stone, a piece of worked silver, and what looked like a carved bone needle. Swiftcloud nodded approvingly at each choice, wrapping them in a small piece of buckskin that she then tied to his belt. Medicine bundle, she explained in halting English, for strength, for wisdom, for connection. Voices outside indicated that other preparations were underway. Through the dwelling's entrance, Ethan could see people moving with purposeful urgency, carrying materials and setting up what appeared to be a ceremonial space in the valley's center. Ayanna appeared in the doorway, and Ethan's breath caught at the sight of her. She wore a dress of white buckskin decorated with beadwork so intricate it seemed like wearable art. Her dark hair was braided with silver ornaments and eagle feathers, and her face bore ceremonial markings that complemented the pattern Swiftcloud had painted on his own features. The ceremonial space is ready, she announced. My father waits to begin the ritual that will make us husband and wife. They walked together toward the ceremonial space that had been prepared in the valley's center. The entire Apache community had gathered men, women, children, elders forming a large circle around an area decorated with symbols drawn in colored sand. At the circle's northern point, Running Bear waited in full ceremonial regalia. Running Bear raised his hand as they approached, calling for silence from the assembled crowd. When the last whisper faded away, he began speaking in Apache, his voice carrying the rhythm and authority of formal ceremony. The words flowed like ancient poetry, connecting this moment to similar moments throughout Apache history. After several minutes of ceremonial recitation, Running Bear switched to English, ensuring that Ethan understood the nature of the commitments he was making. Do you, white man called Ethan Cross, willingly abandon your former life to become a member of our people? I do, Ethan replied, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. Do you swear to protect our ways, our lands, our children, even at the cost of your own life? I swear. Do you accept my daughter as your wife, with all the obligations such acceptance requires? I accept. Running Bear turned to Ayanna, repeating similar questions in both Apache and English. Her responses carried the same weight of formal commitment, the same recognition that they were participating in something that transcended personal preference. When the verbal commitments were completed, Swiftcloud stepped forward carrying a length of braided leather cord. She wrapped it around Ethan's wrist and then around Ayanna's, binding them together in a gesture that seemed to symbolize the permanent nature of their union. The ceremony concluded with the entire community raising their voices in what sounded like a traditional song or chant. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, creating a resonance that seemed to connect this moment to the land itself. But the celebration was interrupted by the sound of gunfire echoing from the canyon's southern approach. The shots were distant but unmistakable, the sharp crack of military carbines rather than the deeper boom of hunting rifles. Every Apache warrior immediately reached for weapons that had been kept discreetly hidden during the ceremony. Women began gathering children and moving toward defensive positions carved into the canyon walls. The peaceful wedding celebration transformed into a community preparing for battle. Running Bear's voice cut through the sudden tension. Morrison's men have found our trail. They approach from the narrow canyon, believing they can trap us against the cliff walls. Ethan felt the weight of his new responsibilities settling onto his shoulders. These were his people now, his family, his obligations. Whatever happened in the next few hours would test his commitment to the vows he had just taken. "How many men?" he asked. 15, maybe 20, Swift Arrow reported, having just returned from a scouting position. They ride in formation, believing they face only scattered resistance. Ethan studied the canyon's geography with tactical eyes, noting the natural choke points and elevated positions that could provide advantages to defenders. The Apache had chosen this location well. It offered multiple escape routes while funneling any attack through predictable approaches. "What's the plan?" he asked Running Bear. The chief's expression carried grim satisfaction. "We give Colonel Morrison exactly what he thinks he wants. A fight that proves. Apache people are dangerous savages who cannot be trusted with peaceful coexistence." The next few minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Warriors took positions among the rocks and caves that lined the canyon walls. Women and children moved to secure areas deeper in the valley. Elders began destroying anything that could provide intelligence to enemy forces if the settlement fell. Ayanna handed Ethan a rifle, a modern Winchester that had obviously been well maintained. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, a reminder of skills that had kept him alive through years of frontier existence. "You take the position near the spring," she instructed, pointing toward a cluster of boulders that commanded a view of the main approach route. "Swift Arrow will be on your left, Black Hawk on your right. Wait for my father's signal before firing." From his position among the boulders, Ethan had an excellent view of the narrow defile through which the soldiers would have to pass to reach the main settlement. The Apache defenders were invisible from the approaching column's perspective, concealed behind rocks and in cave openings that appeared to be natural formations. Morrison called a halt at the canyon's entrance, studying the terrain ahead with obvious suspicion. Even his arrogance couldn't completely overcome tactical caution when entering potentially hostile territory. "You in there!" the colonel shouted, his voice echoing off canyon walls. "I'm here for the fugitive Ethan Cross. Send him out, and there won't be any trouble for the rest of you." Running Bear emerged from concealment near the canyon center, making himself visible while remaining within easy reach of cover. He wore full war regalia, paint, feathers, weapons that spoke of serious intent. "You speak of trouble, soldier chief," the Apache leader called back. "But you bring 20 armed men into lands where you have no authority. Who threatens whom?" Morrison's face darkened at the challenge to his assumed authority. "I have authority wherever criminals hide. Cross is wanted for murder, and I'll have him one way or another." "The man you seek is no longer subject to your justice," Running Bear replied. "He has joined our people through marriage, accepted our protection, sworn our oaths. Apache law governs him now." "Apache law!" Morrison spat. "You savages have no law worth recognizing. Stand aside or face the consequences." The chief raised his hand high above his head, the signal every Apache warrior had been waiting for. When his arm dropped, the canyon erupted in gunfire from positions Morrison's men had never suspected existed. The first volley caught the military column in complete disarray. Soldiers who had been expecting easy intimidation suddenly found themselves taking fire from multiple elevated positions. Horses reared and screamed as bullets whistled through their formation, adding to the chaos and confusion. Ethan picked his targets with careful precision, focusing on soldiers who seemed to be rallying their companions or attempting to establish organized resistance. His Winchester spoke with deadly accuracy, each shot carefully placed to maximum effect. The battle was brief but intense. Within minutes, half of Morrison's men were down, some dead, others wounded too badly to continue fighting. The survivors attempted to retreat back through the canyon entrance, but Apache warriors had moved to block that escape route as well. When the gunfire finally ceased, 13 soldiers lay dead in the canyon dust. Morrison and 6 survivors had been taken prisoner, their weapons confiscated and their hands bound with rawhide strips. The colonel's pristine uniform was torn and dirty, his expression combining rage with the dawning realization of complete defeat. Running Bear approached the captured officer with ceremonial dignity, every inch the victorious war chief confronting a defeated enemy. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of formal judgment. "You came to our land seeking war, soldier chief. You found what you sought. Now you face the consequences of your own choices." Morrison straightened despite his bonds, trying to maintain some semblance of military bearing. "You've signed your own death warrants. The army won't let this attack go unpunished." Several voices called for immediate execution of the prisoners, while others suggested various forms of torture that would serve as warnings to future intruders. The anger in these suggestions was understandable. These people had been living under constant threat from men like Morrison. But Ethan recognized that how they handled this moment would shape everything that followed. Apache treatment of prisoners would be used to justify whatever retaliation the territorial government chose to pursue. "May I speak?" he asked Running Bear. The chief nodded, curious to hear what perspective his new son-in-law might offer. "These men came here as enemies," Ethan began, addressing the assembled warriors. "They sought to harm our people, steal our lands, destroy our way of life. They deserve no mercy for such intentions." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several warriors nodded approvingly at what sounded like support for harsh justice. "But," Ethan continued, "we must think beyond this moment, beyond our anger, beyond our desire for revenge. How we treat these prisoners will determine how the outside world sees us, how they justify their future actions against us." "What do you propose?" Running Bear asked. "We send them back," Ethan replied. "All of them. Alive, unharmed, but carrying a message that cannot be ignored." Several warriors voiced immediate objections, but Running Bear raised his hand for silence. "Explain this message." "We tell the territorial government that Apache people are willing to defend themselves when attacked, but prefer peace when peace is possible. We offer to negotiate new arrangements that recognize both Apache rights and territorial interests." The debate continued for several minutes, with various community members offering their perspectives on how to handle the unprecedented situation. Finally, Running Bear called for silence. "We will send you back to your people alive and unharmed," the chief told Morrison, carrying a message they would do well to consider carefully. The colonel's expression shifted from defiant anger to suspicious confusion. "What message?" "That Apache people prefer peace to war, but are prepared for either. That we seek reasonable accommodation with territorial authority, but will not accept destruction of our way of life." Running Bear moved closer to Morrison. "Return to your superiors. Tell them what you found here. Tell them that further attacks will be met with further resistance, but that negotiation remains possible for those wise enough to pursue it." As the prisoners were prepared for release, Running Bear addressed them one final time, his voice carrying across the canyon with ceremonial formality. "I give you my native daughter as wife, because the man alone defended our lands," he declared, gesturing toward Ethan. The words were clearly intended for Morrison's ears, a message that would travel back to territorial authorities. They established Ethan's new status unambiguously, making it clear that he was now under Apache protection and subject to Apache law. Morrison's eyes fixed on Ethan with naked hatred. "You think changing sides will save you, Cross?" "I think," Ethan replied calmly, "that American justice lost any claim to my respect when it decided to hang me for murders I didn't commit. These people offered me something America never did, the chance to prove my innocence through my actions rather than my words." As the prisoners were escorted toward the canyon's mouth, Ethan realized that his old life was ending as definitively as if he had died in the battle. Ethan Cross the Drifter no longer existed. In his place stood someone new, a man with obligations, connections, purposes that extended far beyond personal survival. The sun was setting behind the canyon's western rim, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate the day's momentous changes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the choices that had been made. Ayanna moved to stand beside him as they watched Morrison's column disappear into the gathering dusk. "Do you regret what you have chosen?" she asked quietly. Ethan considered the question seriously before answering. Everything familiar about his existence had been abandoned. Everything comfortable about his independence had been surrendered. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm part of something worth defending." As they walked back toward the settlement center, Ethan reflected on the words Running Bear had spoken to the prisoners. A native daughter given in marriage to the man who had defended their lands. The statement carried implications that would echo through whatever conflicts lay ahead, marking him as someone who had chosen sides definitively and permanently. The choice felt right. After years of drifting without purpose, he had found people worth serving, causes worth fighting for, a woman worth building a future alongside. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he would face them as part of something larger than himself. The last light faded from the canyon walls as Eagle Ridge settled into evening peace. But Ethan knew that peace was temporary, that Morrison's defeat would likely bring larger forces seeking revenge. The real test of his commitment to his new life was yet to come. He was ready for whatever that test might require.